Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. As we've discussed numerous times on Security Breach, terms like change, evolution, and constant are more than just buzz terms. They're a simple reality of working in the industrial OT space. And whether we're discussing threat actors from Stuxnet to Lockbit, tactics from social engineering to double extortion ransomware, or vulnerability sources ranging from weak passwords to embedded secure by design concerns, the ever-expanding attack surface is a constant reminder of change and the evolving nature of threats. Here to offer some insight on this and other industrial cybersecurity challenges is Michael Haase. He has an extensive background and personal experiences to draw from in helping us to understand all this change and what it means as we look to grow and improve our cybersecurity posture. Michael, thanks so much for joining us today and welcome to Security Breach. So, hey, just to get things going, maybe you can tell the audience a little bit about yourself, some of the things you've been up to lately.
Yeah, on the industrial side, done various things over the years. Probably my first real introduction to industrial automation in general was Y2K work on utility plants back in the 90s. But I worked with a small memory manufacturer. Got to know a bit about wave soldering systems and things like that. That was good, clean fun.
So in your experience, you've been doing this OT cybersecurity deal for a little bit here. What have been some of the biggest changes you've seen over the years, maybe from the good guys and the bad guys? We know things are constantly changing or evolving. What are some of the things that sort of stick out in your mind?
Yeah, number one is the vendors are finally actually starting to take some action. A lot of the newer systems actually do have things like built-in firewalling. So they're not just exposed to whatever network they're connected to. The challenge, of course, is the new systems are expensive. So there hasn't really been much effort to retrofit any of those solutions to existing older systems, if those older systems are even still in support. As far as the bad guys go, much of the work, if you will, has really been more about just taking advantage of vulnerabilities as they exist, kind of as a stepping stone to get to other things. So that one's also, it's been evolving, but fairly slowly, actually, which is good, helpful.
Yeah. You know, one of the things you mentioned there, you said you had a background in working with utilities. That's something that's definitely been in the limelight lately. We've seen a lot of things coming out stemming from an Israeli PLC attack. It was thought to be focused sort of in that part of the world, but it's affecting a lot of plants, even stuff over here in the U.S., breweries, water treatment facilities, things like that. Do you think this is part of a bigger trend that we're going to see moving forward? They started with some of this secure infrastructure, and it's crept into a lot of these manufacturing ICSs.
Yeah, it's really tough to predict. So when I was doing the Y2K assessments back in the mid to late 90s, we actually had a product that we used to assess about half the power plants in America and a few other countries, with Philippines, Japan, Germany, places like that. And what we found was that there was basically zero cybersecurity at that time, which isn't too surprising. And there were a lot of systems that were literally directly connected to dial-up modems and whatnot. So as an adjunct, we were working with the power plants directly, but we were also reporting back to EPRI, which is the Electric Power Research Institute, and the NRC, which is Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So we actually created a separate report to file with them, indicating that there were some serious problems out there that, as time went on, we would see exactly what we're seeing now. The catch is that was back in the mid-90s, and they actually did take some steps to address it back then. But we're not truly seeing the effects until now. So we're talking, 30 years later. And yet, with automations, certainly the bad guys have frameworks that they can plug new attacks into very easily. Time frame from a new attack becoming known to reasonably broad spread deployment across the various malware stacks used to be on the order of 30 days. Nowadays, it could be 4 or 5 hours. I mean, it's extremely quick. So the real limiting factor right now in terms of just an insane explosion in this sort of attack is the fact that a lot of the bad guys' automation on the back end is not set up to quickly and easily plug in, IoT style or just OT style vulnerabilities. So, the Israeli attack and, certainly some of the earlier attacks that had been in the news, like when they went after the Iranian centrifuges and whatnot, those attacks are extremely interesting from a cybersecurity standpoint, but you don't tend to see widespread adoption of those tactics yet, but it's coming. So,
how have those vulnerabilities sort of evolved, or how have you seen them evolve? We know they've gotten more complicated. We know the bad guys have gotten a lot more complex in terms of their structure and everything else. But what has that evolution been like for you? Has it been we're becoming more aware of things, it's just more complex, more in depth, there's more connections, all of that stuff? Or what are some of the bigger areas of evolution that you've seen and experienced?
Yeah, there's the old saying, there's nothing new under the sun. In reality, all of the attacks, all of the attacks that we see nowadays, they're actually in the news because they're sufficiently widespread or costing enough money and damage and whatnot, are all things that were seen as possible either in the lab or in overt attacks, through APTs, advanced persistent threats, a decade ago or even more. So from a cybersecurity standpoint, it's really a matter not so much of detecting new attacks right away, although there is an element of that, but really just seeing what gets adopted, what gets picked up and really spreads. The fact of the matter is that the bad guys, there's just as with any industry or any operation, you have different groups of people, and they have more or less levels of capabilities and understanding and key funding. So the route that we typically see is things like advanced persistent threats that are actually nation state funded are generally the leading edge. So they'll come up with some trick, some 0-day vulnerability, and it could be the Russians, it could be North Korea, it could be the NSA. And the fact is they keep this stuff and they kind of keep it in a lockup, if you will. They try not to use them for as long as they can, because once they use it and it gets discovered, then everybody jumps on it. It's Christmas. So we tend to look at that. For instance, the AI deepfakes and such. I have a presentation that I gave back in 2015 to the wealth management community about audio deepfakes at that time. And yet, we're just kind of starting to see it hit the mainstream now, and video, of course, is hot on its heels. So it's not that these attacks aren't known, it's really just a matter of seeing when they actually really gain a foothold.
Yeah. So as we become more and more aware of all these different ways that we can get hit, how is manufacturing doing as far as learning from these mistakes? Are we sharing information? Are we getting smarter? Or what have been some of the big takeaways hopefully we're getting from some of these more well-known or prominent attacks?
I would draw a very distinct line between learning and action. And manufacturing is no different than any other industry. The fact is, you've got a business, it's operating, you've got a bottom line, you've got your overhead, you're trying to keep your costs down, etc. And the reality is, for most of them, until they get hit, they're not really willing to do anything. And sometimes even after they get hit, they're still not willing to do anything. So it's really great to see that the vendors are finally starting to step up. I mean, that's phenomenal. It gives me hope that in the next 10 to 15 years, we'll see the majority of systems be a lot more secure.
Yeah. I think one of the benefits or things that I've seen, and maybe you're seeing things a little bit differently, but over probably the last 3.5 years or so, I think the attitude in the industrial sector towards cybersecurity has evolved greatly in terms of embracing the fact that we need to invest, we need to get more tools in place, we need to understand our attack surface better. What are you seeing there? Are there been certain things that have improved the attitude, sort of getting buy-in from executives and really the whole enterprise, and embracing cybersecurity as something that's as important as a production flow?
Yeah, there is definitely a much greater overall awareness, and that's on the learning side. They're seeing things in the news. They're realizing that it could apply to them. I mean, you see a hospital or something get breached, and you realize, hey, wait, those are embedded systems. My CNC machines out here are embedded systems, and ironically, from some manufacturers that have really broad coverage across many industries, you'll find that the same protocols are being reused and the same vulnerabilities are present. So where it gets a bit sticky is that a lot of the systems that are out there, a lot of the actual, manufacturing, shop floors and this and that have systems that are really pretty old. I mean, there's CNC machines out there that have been there since the 1980s, and laser cutters dating back to the early 2000s and whatnot. So, and that's because manufacturing systems are designed to be robust. I mean, they're meant to be maintainable and just keep on trucking. So there's kind of a gap right now between what the vendors are doing and what's actually available in the industry. There's certainly been an effort in terms of technology partners, firewall manufacturers and, larger network players like Cisco and that, to say, hey, we've got a solution for your issues here. But the reality is that, every manufacturer grew organically. And so, when you really look at it, I call it growth by accretion. So, they pick up a new customer, they add some more machines to the line, they increase capacity, etc. So every environment has a real mix of old and new equipment, and generally a real mix of, means and modes of connectivity. Some things are networked, some things are still serial, etc., etc. So there really are no one-size-fits-all solutions. And unfortunately, that's what people are really looking for. They want the silver bullet, and it doesn't exist. What I see having the most effect and really the best ROI is where internal IT. So again, hopefully this is a company that's large enough to have a decent internal tech staff. Really understand the problem and are able to work within the budget that they have. One of the biggest tools is simply balkanization. Assume that everything is vulnerable and isolate it as much as possible, and that can be done relatively inexpensively. So there's definitely some traction happening there. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And it's interesting. You bring up a lot of those legacy systems, and that's a challenge right there. And on the security breach here, we talk a lot about secure by design, because we're taking a lot of those legacy systems, we're bringing in new automation controls and connection points, which can be vulnerabilities or soft spots in the defense, yes. But we're not always aware of that, because we think if we're buying something from, you name it, Rockwell, Siemens, or Honeywell, or whomever else, we think it's secure just because we're plugging in. What have you seen there, either in terms of advancements or challenges, with the whole secure by design premise, and maybe some of the assumptions that both the buyer and the seller are making in that whole dynamic?
Yeah, that one's a real can of worms, and I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
So embedded systems generally fall into one of two categories. Either it's PC-based or it's not. And I'm talking from a cybersecurity standpoint, obviously. If it's not PC-based, then you've got a real ceiling on the horsepower that's available. So, whether your system has a control module that's present at the unit on the shop floor, or whether it's a remote system, it's a PC sitting over in the, CAD office or whatever. The fact is your attack surface is really quite variable, and the vendors have different ways of approaching it. So let's take an example of an older legacy system, and then we'll say it's one that's still under support, and the vendor is willing to work with it and come up with a new control for it. You'll have a system that originally might have had a very simple 8-bit or 16-bit processor, or a couple of them, just handling some basic sensors and position management, things like that. Even things like video inputs probably get sent back to a remote processor of some kind. So the system itself, even though it's connected, is fairly simple. And the problem is there's really not a lot of available compute power at that system to do anything with. These systems were originally designed to be as cheap as possible, really. I mean, when you come right down to it, I mean, the vendors are no different than the manufacturers. They're trying to keep their overhead down. So you have a couple options. You can either actually re-architect the system, or you can add something else in, a separate physical firewall, something like that. The catch is that when you're actually out on the shop floor, most manufacturing environments are really noisy. And by that, I mean RFI and EFI. So it's not just a matter of swapping out boards or adding some RAM or doing whatever. There's a lot of testing and QC that's required to ensure that the system's actually still going to be reliable after you're done making those changes. And so what some of the manufacturers are doing, and this makes sense especially for newer equipment, they're isolating the systems, but the point of isolation is actually remote. So you've got your serial cable, you've got your fiber optic link, whatever is going from the system to a remote module of some kind. Now that could be a physical firewall, it could be a serial dongle in between that's watching what's going across the wire. More typically, it's just a PC, and they're just adding it on in software. So the catch there, though, is all of these things require expensive changes. So, any industrial system, even small changes can make a big difference in the efficacy and what all features and functionality it has, and can cost quite a bit. Even if you're off the shop floor, though, you've still got a reliability question, and you've still got a security question, because that system probably is directly attached to the network. So do you trust the local IT staff's own cybersecurity? Do you implement your own? If you implement your own, do you contract it out? Do you build it internally? There's a ton of variables, and they all cost a lot of money. That's the problem.
Well, and kind of what you're talking about are segmentation strategies, correct?
Yeah,
in terms of
exactly.
trying to isolate that. And I think there's a couple of different challenges that we see here in the industrial sector, and I'd like to get your take on it. The first of all is just visibility into what are all my connection points, what are all the assets that I have to secure. And that's a huge ongoing challenge. The others, as you said, cost, and more specifically, getting buy-in from folks sort of up the food chain to support a lot of these initiatives. What have you seen there in terms of either growth, challenges, whatever, in terms of getting better visibility throughout the attack surface, and also getting a little more support financially to support a lot of these cybersecurity initiatives?
Yeah, the financial support's really the biggest one. The fact is, none of these things improve productivity at all. In fact, sometimes they cost productivity, either through downtime for retrofits, or simply, you add an update to a system, makes it more secure, and it also runs slower. And so,
Yeah,
you've got
absolutely.
you've got your operators here banging on the thing in frustration, going, "Come on, this thing used to load in 2 seconds. Now it takes 12." So, and the other challenge is there was a period of time, really in the early 2000s, so a little more than a decade ago, where there were a lot of very simple serial interfaces, and Sun Microsystems did a really good job of pushing Java out. And so there was this kind of period where a lot of vendors were migrating from very simple text-based interfaces on the shop floor to generally Java-based sort of web interfaces. The challenge is that basically anything that was deployed back then is woefully vulnerable. but it does not have the compute power to be secured really at all. So again, it comes down to the money. It's the question really is, where do you spend the money? Do you spend it securing the systems? Do you spend it at the next step out? Wherever somebody's actually working on CNC files, CAD and whatnot, or do you put it at the perimeter of the network, or optimally, do you put it at every point of intersection throughout? But again, the numbers get big pretty quickly. So.
Well, and the task becomes much more daunting. And when things get hard in manufacturing, like you said, and they're not production related, they're not directly related to getting product out the door, they tend to be put on the back burner, which is concerning.
Right.
I think
you get the buy-in, but not the budget.
Exactly, and I think that's where a lot of these exercises in improving visibility of your threat landscape, of your attack landscape, and understanding everything that's out there, hopefully helps manufacturers and others in the industrial sector to start prioritizing those things and not feel so overwhelmed. Understanding, pick your analogy, you can't drink the ocean, you can't eat the elephant all at once, but setting priorities ideally, and hopefully as we get more of these connection points, people don't feel overwhelmed, but to simply realize it's an ongoing and ever-evolving process.
Well, that's you really touched on two things there. One is, what's the best ROI for a dollar, and that really varies from environment to environment. It depends on the deployed systems, and it depends on what's been done previously. The other catch is that it's very easy. I shouldn't say easy. It's relatively simple to get buy-in and budget for a one-time action. But the fact is, cybersecurity is ever evolving. So it's, this is a recurring need every year. And as you say, there is downtime and there is risk too. Vendors will put out updates and there may be bugs or maybe new vulnerabilities. It's hard to tell.
Yeah. Another thing I'd like to get your take on here, Michael, again, looking at things have changed over time. The biggest attack issues or challenges, the types of attacks that manufacturers and industrial security deal with. People are going after data, obviously. That's always been an issue. The denial of service attacks are a huge concern, obviously, when you're an operationally focused enterprise. And ransomware. Again, it's been around forever. When you look at those things in terms of priorities, in terms of defending against, and then also having a good response plan for them, how would you sort of try to prioritize? I know this is it again. It will vary on the environment and everything else, but generally speaking, maybe how have you seen things change, or how would you try to establish some of those priorities?
Really, impact mitigation is what it comes down to. I tell people that really nobody should get ransomware nowadays. It's a well understood threat. We have lots and lots of tools for detecting it and stopping it before it's an issue. But, those tools cost money and they need to be deployed properly, et cetera, et cetera. So, in the grand scheme of things, you really come back to having to assume that anything and everything is vulnerable and will be breached at some point, because cybersecurity is not 100% ever. It's a bottomless rabbit hole, and you're just looking for the lowest hanging fruit, and anything after that is risk analysis. What are the odds that XYZ is actually going to happen, and what's the impact if it does happen? So that is a good question. Certainly the people factor is a big one, but the fact is it doesn't matter how much phishing training and whatnot you do. In any group of people, there will be a small percentage that simply don't think that way. They're extremely good at whatever it is they do. And the reason they're extremely good at that is because they do think differently. But it also means they're more vulnerable. So a lot of these things, the fact that there's even a need for phishing training, I personally consider a massive failure on the part of the technical community. It's like, look, this stuff's been around for decades. Email has never been secure. Why? How have we not fixed this yet? We're supposed. This is literally our job as IT people. And yet, I mean, ultimately, it still comes down to money. The software developers have their priorities, and so do the marketing people and whatnot. And again, security, except in hindsight, doesn't directly add to the bottom line. It's a cost. It's not a profit center. Um,
Yeah. It's an interesting ongoing challenge. I like, you made an interesting comment about we should never get ransomware. What's kind of your thought behind that? I guess because I think there's a notion in ransomware you go one of two ways. Either if we get hit, we're not paying it, we're sticking to it, we've got our data backups and everything else. Or, you know what, I'm going to pay this, get it out the door, hopefully learn my lesson so it doesn't happen again, but I need to move forward. So what do you think are the biggest sticking points on why ransomware continues to be such a repeating issue?
the majority of the issue is simply old infrastructure, and a lack of budget. However, having said that, I would say that one should never, ever be prepared to pay, because the fact is, ransomware still makes a lot of money. And there's a lot of folks out there that would really like to make a lot of money very quickly and easily. And so there's a lot of ransomware that is simply buggy. I mean, it's just software. There's human beings dealing with it, and no offense to the ransomware authors, but their QA is probably not as good as a corporate Fortune 500 software developer. So there's been plenty of cases, and continue to be plenty of instances where people paid the ransom and either didn't get a key, or the key didn't work, or I mean, you can't put it this way: if that's your approach, you're depending on the technical capability of the bad guys, and that seems really risky to me.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's shifting gears here a little bit, Michael. Let's talk about some of the trends and some of the bigger issues that we're talking a lot about when it comes to industrial cybersecurity. The first of which has got to be artificial intelligence. There's a lot of buzz around the best ways to use it. We know how the bad guys are using it in terms of adjusting some of that ransomware code that you were just talking about, social engineering schemes, phishing emails, all of that kind of stuff. What are you seeing more from the good guy side of things? How can we be using AI maybe better or be smarter with it?
Yeah. The number one implementation of AI, which has honestly made a huge difference in cybersecurity, in fact, I was just quoted in an article on it, has simply been deploying it in the SOC. So SOC is Security Operations Center. You really can't build a SOC for less than $1 million. There's a lot of, we'll say, Fortune 10,000 companies that say, "Oh, we've got a SIEM, and we've got a SOC, and we've got this, and we've got that." But the fact of the matter is, unless you've spent a fair amount of money and gotten some real experts in to design and implement the SOC, you're not going to do a great job of catching things and responding to them in a timely manner. Fortunately, there have been a lot of third parties, including third-party cybersecurity vendors, who have done a very, very good job of implementing their SOCs, and you get that service as part of your deployment of their software. So in terms of endpoint security, there's actually some really good solutions out there now which depend heavily on AI on the back end. So one which I'll mention here because it works very well. It has the AI on the back end and is almost always one of the layers that my companies deploy, is Sentinel-1. So the Sentinel-1 has an interesting history, and actually this is true for most of them. I mean, whether it's CrowdStrike or Huntress or whoever, a lot of these companies have implemented AI on the back end. But the fact is, a lot of them are really geared at Fortune 500. And so their licensing is similar. You need hundreds or thousands of seats before they'll even talk to you. And that's where a third-party provider really comes in, because if you pool all of a third-party provider's clients, then you reach that licensing threshold and you can actually deploy that stuff. But the reason that's important is the AI that they've deployed is really augmenting existing systems. It's not a replacement at all. So the net effect is you can have an endpoint, could be a traveling salesman's laptop, who knows? something gets into it in their hotel Wi-Fi. Sentinel-1's AI will detect and stop whatever this unknown activity is, typically within 30 seconds. I mean, it is mind-blowingly fast. And then with the SOC on the back end, with 24/7 manning, you've got a real human being looking at it within typically less than 5 minutes, which is that's amazing. I mean, that's how ransomware gets stopped. It gets detected and it gets cut off at the knees almost instantly. But if you don't have that capability, time is not your friend. No, and that's really the problem. And not all systems can even support that level of protection because they just don't have the onboard horsepower to handle it. So again, that comes back to the segmentation. You try to have some other system, one layer out that does have that capability. So.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, we're just trying to make the hacker's job as hard as possible so that they go
Yes.
someplace else,
Yes.
Ideally, and hopefully it's far away.
Yeah, here's the thing, though. The going someplace else, I mean, physical security, you got your fancy locks, you've got your Fort Knox approach. Technically Fort Knox could be breached. It's just not worth the effort. The challenge with cybersecurity, and so this is really where we kind of see the cutover between the well-funded, nation states coming up with things versus the widespread adoption. The fact is, the vast majority of cybersecurity attacks are fully automated. They do not care if you're Fortune 500 or if you're literally a two-person mom and pop, 3D printing startup or something. They're going to hit you the same way, just as hard, and they're going to ransom all your stuff the same way, just as hard, and you're equally vulnerable. And that's a real problem because Fortune 500 has the budget and they can pay for things like Sentinel-1. Whereas, the mom and pop shops simply don't have a budget.
Yeah. Well, and what we're seeing now with a lot more supply chain focused hacks, those mom and pops become much more prominent. And that's why the ransomware attackers are so fixated on them at this point, because they're in a corner when it comes to paying. Makes their decision, unfortunately, very easy in terms of just paying the ransomware so they can get back online. And then we get into dwelling attacks and a bunch of other challenges that we still have to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a ton of AI activity happening. So there's an area where we're seeing the groundwork laid for attacks that haven't happened yet. So there's the biggest one is the mass adoption of AI by everybody. It doesn't matter whether you're a CEO or whether you're the mail guy. You're probably playing around with AI to some extent or the other. Where it's becoming challenging is AI is making it a lot easier to build workflows. So you've got data here and you want it over there, and it would cost $100,000 to bring somebody in to write a conduit for you. But hey, here's this AI tool that I can just plug it in and it'll do it for me, and it's amazing. Never mind how accurate it may or may not be. People are doing this, so the bad guys are paying attention to that. So there's workflow automation attacks that are already happening. They're targeted attacks. They're not automated yet, and that's what I personally am watching most closely. I'm seeing attacks that are really aimed at Fortune 500, but the concepts behind them, the way they're being handled, could apply to any company. And so it's really just a matter of the bad guys updating their automation frameworks for this to become widespread fairly quickly. So it's kind of like the supply chain attack that we all know and don't love. Your vendor, your customer, whoever gets breached, and then the trust relationships that you have in place with them allow that breach to spread into your systems. That's also possible with workflow automation, both within the company and across corporate borders as well. That's coming very soon.
Michael, this has been great. We've covered a lot of ground, talked about a lot of different stuff. You've got a ton of experience, again, in industrial cybersecurity. So a lot of things we've talked about have been challenges, and we're still figuring out solutions. There's been progress, but there's still a lot of stuff out there that can keep us up at night. So my question to you is, what helps you sleep at night? When you lay down, what gives you some reassurance that we are making progress, we are doing things well, and there is some positivity out there in the industrial cybersecurity world?
I would say number one is the fact that the bad guys are evolving. If we weren't getting to this stuff and responding to it and coming up with mitigations and tools and technologies, they wouldn't have to evolve.
Yeah, okay. It's an
So,
interesting perspective.
I mean, it's an arms race, but as long as we can stay one step ahead of them, I'm much happier.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anything else you'd like to share before we say goodbye here?
The fact is, there's going to be, I believe, a pretty fundamental change in AI-based attacks soon. There's a couple things that are happening that we can see kind of a trend in this direction. So I mentioned the workflow attacks and supply chain attacks. The bad guys are working on AI-driven systems that are very, very good at linking previously disconnected or unrelated attacks. So the complexity and intensity of the attacks can be made an order of magnitude greater simply by adding AI.
To catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@ien.com. For Michael Haase, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.